Thank you. Thanks, Sophie. Thank you for having us. We're really happy to be here, and there have been some amazing speakers, so thanks for coming along. We may seem like four random people from around the world, but we've all worked with each other in one way or another. I think these guys have all worked with each other in South Africa, is that right?
Yep. Oh, me and Guy.
Yeah. And I've worked with Jane in Brazil and the other two in Melbourne and Australia. And over the last 18 months or so, we've been having these discussions about how things have been changing. And that's what made us think of maybe sharing some of our thoughts with you. All right. So yeah, Guy is in Switzerland at the moment, not Berlin, but he's joining us on his holiday. I'm going to ask Guy a question in a minute, but please, after I've asked the panelists questions, if you've got a follow-up question you want to ask, please type it in the chat, and I'll do my best to ask that question, or one of the panelists will see it and answer it. Right. So I'll get straight on with Guy, your question, your first question. So it's a big question for one person, but does the research say that online teaching is effective?
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? So good morning, everyone. Yes, I think the quick answer is it depends. It depends on what the teaching consists of, and it depends on how it's done. It's important to remember that although computer-assisted language learning has been around since the 60s, the use of video teleconferencing software is a fairly recent phenomenon, and particularly in language teaching. And certainly with the explosion of the online teaching that we've seen over the past year, we can say that that's quite recent. And because it's fairly new, it's not surprising that as a field, we're still adjusting and we're still learning lots. And I'm sure that for a lot of trainers and a lot of teachers, the learning curve has been quite steep over the last 12 months. It's also important to remember that computer-assisted language learning has reflected some of the key developments in language teaching. So for example, the drill and practice programs of the 60s and 70s and the CD-ROMs, the communicative video games of the 90s, where language was taught implicitly. So, of course, now we know that the latter is more optimal for language acquisition. So I think fundamentally, the question is not whether online teaching is effective. Clearly it can be effective, and clearly it has lots of potential. I think what the question that we should be asking is how online teaching can reflect what we now know helps with language acquisition. And that applies equally to virtual classrooms and in-person classrooms, whether it's teaching or teacher training, Nikki.
Okay, all right. If anyone's got a question, by the way, please type it in and I'll ask Guy. But you were talking about second language acquisition. So what actually helps with that, in your opinion?
Well, I think the key word here is acquisition. So I'm not referring to preparation for exams or tests, which test learners' knowledge of verb structures, for example, or discrete language items. So that's another discussion for another day. But we now know that there is little evidence to support the use of mechanical practice, for example. So learners doing gap fills, where each gap is an example of the present perfect, or teachers using substitution drills to teach learners the present perfect. We also know that learners need lots of input, so reading and listening. And by input, not just input, but comprehensible input. Because otherwise, with listening, for example, it's just noise if it's not comprehensible. And if it's just noise, learners can't notice language forms and they can't notice interesting language. And as teachers, by providing learners with lots and lots of input, we're also maximizing opportunities for incidental learning of vocab. And we know from corpus linguistics now that natural English includes quite a lot of word patterns, for example, collocations. So it's important to focus on that. It's important to focus on distributed practice, like there was a talk by somebody about Duolingo. So Duolingo has one of its inbuilt features is this distributed practice to help with retention of vocab. Finally, we know that learners need to produce output that's not limited, but is sustained. So not gap filling, not playing with words, for example, but they need to produce sustained output via communicative tasks, via challenging communicative tasks. So students doing things in the language. And yesterday, Neil Anderson and Neil McCutcheon showed us two great examples of task-based learning tasks using Jamboard. And I think, finally, because classroom time is limited, it's precious, isn't it? So we really should be focusing as teachers on helping learners to have practice, to plan and perform communicative tasks, to repeat communicative tasks, and to receive pertinent feedback from us as teachers. So yes, language learning can be effective, but I suppose it can be effective if it takes into account what we know about what is effective with language acquisition. So digital tools can be overwhelming. I think we need to go back to basics and look at fundamentals and use that as our guiding principle, Nikki.
Okay, great, thank you. And great to mention that task-based learning session. One of the attendees has mentioned that as well. So great answer. So just moving on to comparing a little bit about the online teaching and on-site face-to-face teaching. Mo, do you think on-site teaching, so on-site face-to-face teaching, is intrinsically better than online?
Oh, well, I mean, the short answer is obviously no, seeing as we're at a Ed Tech Symposium. But I mean, traditionally, trainers will have grown up being taught face-to-face themselves and have done lots of their teaching and training as face-to-face teaching. And when you have experienced teachers on a CELTA course, they will have done most of their teaching in a face-to-face classroom. So that's a very familiar and comfortable way of teaching, and people can become scared of the tech. So possibly people do teach better when it's face to face because that's what they're used to. But the online, that's just the tools, that's just the equipment. The teaching's exactly the same. All of those things that Guy's just been talking about, that have been talked about throughout this symposium, that's good teaching. And it's using the online tools and hardware and becoming familiar with that so that you can teach well. I mean, when on a CELTA course, the trainees who learn on a 100% CELTA course, which is just really a new thing from Cambridge, the assessment criteria are exactly the same because the qualification has to be the same for it to be a CELTA. And it is because they're just using all the same communicative approach methodologies that we use face-to-face, but in an online environment. And what I find, it's been really interesting for me and very exciting because I'm training teachers on an online CELTA course, So they're learning the teaching at the same time as they're learning the tech. So it's not that they've become familiar with teaching in face-to-face and now have to struggle with the tech. They're doing it integrated, and it honestly, it only takes the first couple of teaching practice sessions for even not very digitally literate trainees to step up and work out how to do it. And so it feels like, you know, potentially the next generation of teachers who are not going to be afraid of tech. They're learning how to teach online, and so that's how they're doing it, and it feels extremely positive thing to be part of.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, someone's just saying here that, you know, we all had to learn as we were doing when we were learning to be teacher trainers online, and the same for the trainees. But Mo, what kind of things do you think that teachers or trainers might say inadvertently, you know, by accident, that could have a negative effect with people who are learning online? Because I've noticed that with teachers and sometimes with even trainers.
Yes.
Do you think they mention some kind of the discourse around online learning? They might kind of mention something negative, and what kind of effect does that have?
Yes, I agree. I think what we've just been saying, that maybe slight fear factor of just lack of familiarity can, yes, we have to watch how we phrase things. So, for example, I was thinking about when you're doing the basic receptive skills procedure. So if you're in a face-to-face classroom, you set the GIST task, they do it, and then you just quickly put people into pairs, the students into pairs for a minute or less, just to quickly confer. So you can't do that online because of the time it takes to set up the breakout rooms to put people in pairs and get them back out. It takes too long. So a trainer, instead of just a trainer might say something like, well, normally you put them into pairs and then for a couple of minutes, but we can't do that because the breakout rooms that's just not worth it. Takes too long to sort it out. So they framed that in quite a negative way. I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that in a face-to-face classroom, put the students in pairs and let them check quickly. But on the online, no, don't do that. Do the answers to a GIST task in the chat box, because you still want to prevent a student from yelling out the answer and no one else having a chance to think. So it's just a different way of managing a quick check, is to say, don't say the answer, put the answer in the chat box, and then everybody does. But it's avoiding the words like normally, and it's a waste of time, or it's not worth it. It's all of that kind of thing. What about you, Nikki? Do you think there's other, you said you've heard some other things?
No, well, I have, and I think there was, you know, the emergency going online discourse, where I heard sometimes people saying, look, I don't want to be here, you don't want to be here, but this is what we've got, which is very negative things to say. But we're not in that kind of phase anymore, so hopefully people aren't saying that kind of stuff, because I think the students and trainees, I mean, trainees choose to do an online CELTA, so it's definitely seen as an alternative, not as a second-rate thing to be doing stuff online. So we're moving into, well, we've already moved into that. So, you know, I hope that people aren't saying those things as much, Mo, but by accident. But there's some good things people, I don't know if the panelists have noticed in the panel chat, Joanne said that she thinks there's more planning. It's about, you can't be as spontaneous, rather than being afraid of tech. It's more about you can't be as spontaneous or react spontaneously online, and it involves more planning. Would you agree with that? The planning aspect?
I mean, I don't know, like if you're doing more project work and task-based work and flipping the classroom, you can get the learners to be doing a lot of more stuff outside. I know what Guy was saying about maximizing the use of the online environment. When you've got it, you can send people off to do stuff and then come back and make extremely useful time. So not sure if you mean planning that you had to do a lot of making slides and stuff. I don't think it's ever about the materials, really. It's about, you can still do a dogme lesson online. I have done. Yeah, I'm not sure. It possibly, I would say it would very much depend on the exact context.
Yeah, and this is something that'll come in when we're chatting with Jane in a minute as well. So maybe some of these questions about planning and activities and students getting distracted will be covered. But I just wanted to say something that that Claire said. Oh yeah, some classrooms flip it. So people are already thinking on the same lines as Yuma about flipping the classroom. And I think Guy was alluding to that as well, weren't you, Guy, when you were saying about let's get the students practicing
Yes.
more
Yes.
class time, using that time, use of the time. Yeah.
Yes, I think Maurizio mentioned and made an interesting point about the fact that perhaps there's less, because feedback is not immediate in online learning, it gives the impression that it's less effective. I'm not really sure what you mean by that, Maurizio, but I mean, yesterday Neil, in the talk, the task-based learning talk, there were some examples of how teachers can give immediate feedback through Google Docs or chat. So yes, I mean, I think that there is this impression that virtual classrooms are less effective, and there's a whole discourse around it that kind of give this implicit message that it's not an ideal form of teaching, but it has lots of potential and it can be very effective.
Great, thanks Mo.
You're welcome.
All right, Jane, I've got a question for you, which is how can you get the trainees on a CELTA course? How can you get, or a Delta even, how can you get the trainees to use online tools independently?
Hello, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Yes, I think exactly as everybody's been saying, that you can transfer the skills from face-to-face to online, but you're with a different tool. I think the main thing, and I've just been reading the comments, which is so interesting, but one of the main things is getting the trainees accustomed to using different tools, Zoom or whatever it is, and also the students, which we'll look at later. So a lot of places now are looking at teachers, looking at trainers, and they've got in their contract things about digital literacy, things about the device use, things about the broadband in the area they're in. And some areas, as we know, the broadband is not very good. Also having workshops or using the tools like Zoom or tutorials, having more time for it, encouraging people to use these great tutorials like Russell Stannard's and things like that. I've been working on projects where we've actually had rehearsals on CELTA courses of their first teaching practice lessons. So the whole lesson, and then we give feedback as tutors. That's another way. Also just having rehearsals of one stage of the lesson. So as people have been putting in the comments, flipping it. So getting students to plan it, think about it, coming back and having just a rehearsal of the lesson, which really, really works, because they have a lot of peer feedback and they can also have tutor feedback and focus on things like particularly the difficult things like instructions, setting up tasks, monitoring and things like that. Also having, and a lot of centres do now, having checklists. So having checklists for trainees, teachers, and also for students on the tools that they can use. And I think I stole one from IH Izmir when we first started going online with CELTA courses, and it was really useful. So things like, can you mute, unmute? Can you make breakout rooms? And then people could add things and tick things off as they went along. Also in input sessions, I've been realizing that I needed, if I wanted to really promote online teaching rather than remote teaching and try and use some of the tools, I needed in my input sessions to actually use some of the tools. So I did things like having pronunciation, in my pronunciation sessions, having a pronunciation quiz using Socrates. I don't know if I've pronounced that properly. And I adopted that idea from people in IH Sydney, from Nina and Julianto in IH Sydney. And again, using that tool, then the trainees looked at the tool and then they evaluated it, okay, and said, okay, how did you think it was? How was it for you? Could you use it in your lessons? I also got, in some of sessions, but also independently, I got teachers and trainees to research and have a checklist. So you choose one particular tool. I think a lot of people have been saying, like Graham's just been saying as well, that people can get overwhelmed with all the tools and all the webinars. It's just like it's overkill. So I was like thinking like baby steps and getting them to just choose one and to research. And again, there's a checklist. I love checklists. Things like, you know, is it free? Number one priority for me. Does it generate effective activities? Is it fun? Are the instructions clear? And again, they could share it in a session, or also they could have like a Padlet or on Google Docs, and they could actually have their ideas and their findings, and they could have a record in the teaching practice group or in the group of teachers in a sort of virtual staff room. Also, I got them to rank it from like 1 to 5 in terms of effectiveness. Those things that they could keep on adding to. And also then the last thing is like encourage teachers and also trainees to go on to webinars and Facebook groups. And one of the ones that I loved was the Trinity Transformative Teachers Facebook group, because it had very, very practical ideas. And again, make sure people don't get overwhelmed. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. I've noticed there are lots of comments. There have been quite a few comments kind of between Mo's questions and your questions about specific kind of techniques, you know, feedback techniques you can do online, things you can do online that you can't necessarily do in a classroom as well, maybe. So I want to move on to the next question, which is, which techniques do you think are easier with online teaching in the online context?
First of all, I think exactly as we've been saying, and exactly I think people were saying in Graham's session, we have to make sure that in teacher training that the trainees are familiar with the platform. But I think this is also essential for the students. And again, some students don't have such good broadband, some students don't actually have the space. And I think, you know, obviously encouraging them, somebody I think put here that they don't have the digital literacy or their level of the language is very low. So my number one priority was actually with the students and also with CELTA, with the teaching practice students. So I did things like exactly the same, having things like when you interview them, you know, like asking them these questions, probably it would have to be translated. And having things like, so making sure that with the Zoom tools, it's all very, very clear for them, that they can see the tools, that you have pictures of the tools. Also having demonstrations, rehearsals with the students, having things translated as well, you know, like, so what if I have no connection, and having that translated. And also using stronger students to actually translate and help the weaker students, and giving them a chance to get used to it, okay? So for me, some techniques which have transferred are things like, you know, like you can be very collaborative in breakout rooms. You can have flipped activities, as we talked about, so you can get students to use Padlet or Pinterest or Google Docs, and they can be like some sort of brainstorming before an activity which they do outside the classroom and come back in, okay? And we can do that on Padlet. You can use Flipgrid, one of my favorites, which is a really good free tool for speaking activities. And again, you could get students to record things. So things like their favorite food or something like that. And then the other students can comment on it. And this is really good. And things like Flipgrid are very good, because students have a record of their speaking, and then people can refer back to it. And also teachers can also give them feedback on it. And also you can add things, so you can add pictures, you can add videos as well. Things like find someone who, I think you can do. You can do it if you open up the rooms, and you make the rooms self-selected rooms on breakout rooms, and students can move around. And then you can do things like having a rule like you can only move if there are 2 or less students in a room. Karen Wiggerston of the British Council did a running dictation. Brilliant, right? Again, the same thing, using self-selected rooms. The thing is, though, things, as we know, do take much longer. So I think, you know, for like a 60-minute lesson, which is in person, probably it's going to be 40 minutes online, okay? And again, you can, I think things which are really good is you can record the lessons. You know, so you can, if you can get permission, so the students have a really good idea of their progress. And again, they could have like a checklist of things to work on. So they've got some sort of way of having progress. The teacher can do feedback on it and they can do the task again and see their progress. I think that answered it. Did that answer the question? I've got my notes here. I'm rattling through.
Yeah, good. Because I've got your another question for you, which is kind of my last question. Really. Okay, there's been some great comments in the chat about TBL and DogMe. Yeah, about recording. Yeah, we don't want them to rely on and not attend class. Oh, that's a good point. I think we've all had some difficulties with the students ghosting or not attending or getting distracted, like somebody else said earlier.
And that could be contract as well. I mean, contract, yeah. Yeah, good. Jane, I've got a question before we ask my last question, which is it possible to say that CELTA lessons on Zoom might have become more teacher-fronted? What do you think about that? It could be. It could be. But I've got some ideas here, right?
Are we moving on to the last question?
Okay, no, I'm just going to say, I think it can be. However, with the last question, I think I'm going to cover it. But I think we can just keep on encouraging all these different activities and the use of breakout rooms and the use of chat box, which we'll look at in a minute. And I actually think instructions can be easier online because, but you have to plan them. I think somebody was saying it does take a lot of planning, but if you plan them and you have very clear instructions, you put them on your slide, you put them in the chat box, you do a demonstration and you put them in the broadcast for all on Zoom, then you're sort of covered. Yeah. I think that's actually easy. Yes,
all right, so my last is, what are your 10 top tips for online teaching, Jane?
Hooray, great. Well, my big thing is keep it simple. I think we've been overloaded, so it's bite-sized things. It's not to do with specific different tools, it's to do with what we've got, right? So this is pretty obvious. Number one, everything takes longer. So things like breakout rooms, when you set them up, reduce it to 10 or 15 seconds. People have been doing that already, but I think that's quite essential because things do take longer, and also keep it very simple. Number two, embrace the silence. Allow people to think. It might be quite scary, but allow people to think and process. Nominate students. So use things like the word wall. You can have the random wheel, you know, and use it to nominate. Give them time to answer, okay? Turn taking, negotiate how turn taking can be. Number three, use of the chat box. I think as Mo said, use the chat box for easy answers, for gist tasks, maybe lead-in tasks. You can make it competitive, right? Especially for young learners. Say, right, first person to get the answer, right, gets a prize, gets 1 point. Or I think I've seen this before in lessons I've observed, which is great. Get everybody to put in the answer at the same time. So you can go like 1, 2, 3, post. And this means that not just one person dominates with the answers and people copy, but everybody puts in the answer. So that's making it more communicative, less teacher-centered. Also for receptive skills, the chat box, and I've seen this, which is, I think is a great idea, is you pair up for listening, you pair up students as you would in a classroom. So you just send the students, you pair them up and they send each other an instant chat, an instant message in the chat box, okay? Okay, number one, you can't actually see what they're saying, but they can be together and they can share ideas. Number 5, whoops, sorry, my notes here. Reading, you can turn off your video when they're reading, okay, and then turn it on and they know the time is up. Obviously give a clear time limit as well. Number 6, listening. This is quite controversial, but I like this one. And I think I stole this one from the Trinity course, the CERT OT. They've got a new course coming out in August, which is great, by the way. So students turn their camera off and their mic off when they're listening. Feedback, they press the space bars to unmute when they have the answer. They turn their camera on when they don't understand the answer. I've done this with some classes, it worked really well, not so good with other classes. Obviously, perhaps with lower level classes, this would have to be translated because it gets a bit complicated. Okay, number 7, excuse me, my notes here. Pronunciation. I think you can do it really well online. You can actually get your mouth up to the screen as long as you have clean teeth. And then you can do lots of drilling. So I think Melissa Lamb in IH London was doing a lot of drilling techniques using Adrian Underhill's techniques. So things like you say the word, the student has to sort of think about the shape, then they have to say the word and they have to mumble it. Then they have to move their lips and see the position. You can actually do this really well online. But again, it could take time. And again, instructions need to be clear. Number 8, speaking activities. Using speaking activities when they're in the breakout rooms, use the chat box and get the students to say, right, please can you use some language? For example, you can use an announcement tool. Use a phrase to check what you've heard from your partner, okay? Number 9, use the spotlight tool in Annotate to highlight instructions. And number 10, use breakout rooms, which we are all doing, for jigsaw activities like information gap, listening, reading. I think Joker Conga first said how good it was, and I agree. And my last one is always have a plan B. That's it.
Right, I think that was 11.
Was it? Okay, I can't count, never been good at maths.
But thank you. We don't mind the last one. Those are great tips, Jane. And some people we can see from the chat that lots of people have been doing some of these and others not. And I do have a question from Debbie saying, how did the running dictation work? Can you give details? Oh,
right, okay. Yeah, so the running dictation, what they did, they put in the box. So they just put little messages in the Zoom box. I think they got like 2 or 3 students to actually be in the breakout rooms. Okay, so 2 or 3 students were actually giving some of the information, and then the others were running from room to room. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. That's great. Yeah, I want to try that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you had so maybe 3 or 4 stronger students in each room, and they would go, and the others would go from room to room and go back.
Cool. Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay, so Kelly, I think that's our. I mean, I've got this awful Adelaide half hour when I'm half an hour behind, but I think it's 6:55. Am I right? And is that the end?
Yeah, it is time to finish, but please take your time to answer a couple more questions because we only have to finish at 7 and the wrap-up's really quick. So you've got probably 2 more minutes.
Oh, somebody says about you can do it with Chinese whispers. Brilliant.
Yeah.
That's so clever. I love it. Sorry.
It's great to see some of our friends here. I can see them in the chat, which is fantastic. Thank you for coming. Does anybody have any other questions for any of the panelists in these last 2 minutes? Oh, I think there's a question there.
I saw someone's asking about research into the ideal number of students. I don't know about research, but I do know that I once had 45 Chinese students, and I think if you've got more than one screen, it's really difficult. I found it really difficult. And I know I did some IELTS training and we were limited to 10 because two hosts and 10 participants was the maximum number of people who could fit onto one screen. So I do think that might be a rule of thumb, that if you really only want one screen full of people in order to manage, especially when you've got novice teachers, I think. But that's just experience, not research speaking.
Okay. Somebody's asked Jane about when the Trinity course is being launched.
Oh, yes. It's been, the only reason I know about it, I was one of the guinea pigs, right, which was great, you know. It's been launched, I think, end of July, beginning of August. It's the CERT, I've written it down here, the Trinity CERT OT online teaching. It's also, I think, FutureLearn is really good as well. But this course, I think you have to pay for it, but it has whole lessons. So it has teachers doing whole lessons, and then they dissect the lesson. It has lesson plans as well. It has some really good techniques, which is sort of, for me, like a follow on from the FutureLearn. And a lot of people are saying, particularly for their CELTA trainees, why don't we, after they've done the CELTA course, you know, encourage them to do this online course to help them.
Thank you. I think it's better for a little bit more experienced teachers, possibly. Okay, great.
Nikki, I think there's a question about activities for pronunciation.
Oh, okay. That's a good question, but I think we have to finish.
Yeah, we probably do have to wrap up, but if you want to pop that question into the Q&A, whoever asked it, then feel free, panelists, to jump into the Q&A and answer it in writing. And any other questions you have, audience members, you can pop in the Q&A box.
Can I just say one more thing?
Of course.
I'd like to thank you, Nikki, for leading this panel on your birthday.
Yeah.
Say, Nikki.
What a hero.
Going out.
Happy birthday.
Oh, thanks, Mo. I'm a bit embarrassed now.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank the panel for this incredibly rich discussion, and it was a really uplifting way to end the symposium on that note of embracing this change that we're all part of. Thanks also to the audience members during that discussion for your really fantastic ideas and your comments in the chat. It's incredible to think that we all only embarked on this journey less than 18 months ago, and the collective knowledge that's been, you know, that's made us arrive at this point in this discussion is really amazing to witness. So thank you to the panelists, and thanks to everyone in the audience.